The Valori Empire had ruled the Crescent Nebula for 3,000 years, and they had done so not through war or conquest, but through wisdom and careful stewardship of their corner of the galaxy. Their homeworld was called Valor Prime, and it orbited a dying red giant star that bathed everything in crimson light and deep shadows that stretched for miles across the barren surface. But beneath that surface, something ancient slumbered in the deep places of the world. The creature had many names in Valori history, but most simply called it the Leviathan, and it was older than their civilization and older than their recorded memory, and perhaps older than the star itself. The beast measured 300 kilometers from its massive skull to the tip of its armored tail, and its body was covered in layers of living stone and mineral deposits that had built up over millions of years of dormant sleep. Its claws could tear through starship holes like paper, and its furnace belly burned with temperatures that matched the core of small stars. The Valori had discovered the creature long ago when their ancestors first dug deep into the planet searching for minerals and resources to build their growing civilization. Instead of fleeing in terror, they had chosen to build their world around the sleeping giant, and they had constructed their greatest cities in the hollow spaces between its calcified fins and along the ridges of its mountainous spine. The capital city of the Saw rose from the creature's shoulder blade, and nearly 10 million people lived within sight of the Leviathan's sealed eye, which was larger than most lakes and covered in a membrane of crystallized fluid. High Seismark Corvain Thess was the keeper of the Ancient One, and her family had held this sacred duty for 17 generations, stretching back to the founding of the modern empire. She stood now in the deep observatory, where massive instruments measured every tremor and vibration from the creature below, and her face was pale with fear as she studied the readings on her screens. The Leviathan had a heartbeat that the Valori had measured and recorded for centuries, and that heartbeat came once every 73 years, like clockwork, never varying and never changing in all of recorded history. But today the heartbeat had come early, and not just by days or months, but by 41 years ahead of schedule. Corvain pressed her hand against the cool stone wall and felt the faint vibration of something stirring far below, and she knew in her bones that something terrible was coming. She turned to her assistant Mara, who stood trembling near the door with data tablets clutched against her chest. "Contact the Imperial Council immediately," Corvain said, and her voice was steady, even though her heart raced with dread. "Tell them the Ancient One awakens, and tell them I do not know why." The answer came 3 hours later, when long-range sensors detected something emerging from the darkness beyond the outer rim of their solar system. Admiral Esra Vane was the first to see the enemy clearly, and she stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Eternal Vigil, as the tactical displays filled with more hostile signatures than she had ever seen in her 30 years of service. The creatures were called the Zerathine, and they were not ships in any traditional sense, but living organisms that swam through the void of space like predators hunting prey. Each one was a bioship, and a self-contained ecosystem of horrors, and they ranged in size from frigate-class hunters that moved in packs to the dreaded matriarch vessels that spanned continents and birthed smaller predators while they fed. The Valori had encountered these monsters once before, nearly 1,000 years ago, and the records from that time spoke of devastation and death on a scale that still haunted their collective memory. Their ancestors had barely survived that first encounter, and they had done so only because of the Leviathan, which had risen from its sleep to drive the invaders away. Now the sky beasts had returned, and they came in numbers that dwarfed the ancient records. 17 hive clusters emerged from the darkness, and each cluster contained hundreds of individual creatures, all moving with terrible purpose toward the heart of the Valori Empire. Admiral Vane counted the signatures on her display and felt her stomach turn cold as the numbers climbed higher and higher until the screen could barely contain them all. The Imperial fleet was the pride of the Valori civilization, and it numbered 400 warships crewed by the finest officers and soldiers in the Empire. Against this swarm, they might survive for hours. If they were lucky, send word to every ship in the fleet. Vane said to her communications officer, "All vessels are to form up at Defensive Position 7 and prepare for combat operations." She paused and looked around at her bridge crew and saw the fear in their eyes, mixed with determination and loyalty. "And tell them the truth." She continued, "Tell them what we face, and tell them that today we fight not for victory, but for time." The question that hung unspoken in the air was simple and terrifying: time for what exactly? Far below in the deep observatory, Corvain Thess felt another tremor run through the stone beneath her feet, and she understood now why the Leviathan had stirred from its ancient slumber. The beast could sense the approaching threat, and it was trying to wake itself to defend the world it had called home for so long. But Corvain had studied the Leviathan her entire life, and she knew something that filled her with despair. The creature was not ready to fight, and 1,000 years was not enough time to heal the wounds it had suffered. In the last battle, if it rose now to face this swarm, it would die, and its death would crack the planet apart and kill everyone on the surface. She closed her eyes and felt tears roll down her cheeks as she realized that her people faced a choice that no civilization should ever have to make. The first shots of the battle erupted in the outer system as advanced elements of the Zerathine swarm encountered Valori patrol vessels, and the war for survival had begun in the capital city of Desolor. People looked up at the crimson sky and wondered if they would live to see another sunrise, and deep below the surface the Leviathan stirred in its endless dreams and began the slow process of waking, while the world above it trembled with fear and hope and desperate courage. The first battle lasted only 17 minutes, and it ended with the complete destruction of the Valori patrol squadron that had been stationed near the outer asteroid belt. Captain Vorith Khan had commanded that squadron, and his final transmission played on repeat across every military channel in the Empire as a warning to all who would face the Zerathini. "They move like nothing I have ever seen." His voice crackled through the static of damaged communications. "Our weapons hurt them, but they do not stop, and they do not retreat, and they just keep coming and coming, and there are so many of them." The transmission ended with screaming and the sound of metal tearing apart, and then silence. "Admiral." Vane listened to the recording 3 times, and each time she felt her resolve harden like steel in a forge. She had known soldiers like Vorith Khan for her entire career, and she had trained with him and shared meals with him and called him friend. Now he was gone and swallowed by the endless hunger of the swarm. Along with every man and woman under his command, the Zerathine were unlike any enemy the Valori had faced in living memory. And they operated not as individual ships, or even as a coordinated fleet, but as a single massive organism spread across thousands of bodies. Each creature in the swarm shared some kind of connection with the others, and they communicated through biological signals that Valori scientists could detect but not understand. When one beast spotted prey, the entire swarm knew instantly, and they would converge from all directions, like antibodies swarming toward an infection. The smallest of the creatures were the hunter beasts, and they measured roughly 200 meters in length, with sleek bodies covered in chitinous armor and dozens of grasping limbs that could latch onto ships and tear them apart. They hunted in packs of 50 or more, and they were fast enough to catch even the quickest Valori interceptors. The warrior beasts were larger and more heavily armored, and they served as the main combat force of the swarm, with biological weapons that could fire streams of corrosive acid or launch clusters of explosive parasites at enemy vessels. But the true nightmares were the matriarchs, and there were 3 of them in this swarm, each one spanning nearly 50 kilometers of living tissue and bone and armor. The matriarchs were mobile breeding factories that consumed biomass and converted it into new hunter beasts and warrior beasts, which they released in endless waves. As long as the matriarchs survived, the swarm would continue to grow and replace its losses, Admiral. Vane gathered her senior officers in the war room of the Eternal Vigil, and she laid out the tactical situation with brutal honesty. "We cannot defeat them in open battle," she said, and her voice was calm despite the grim words. "Our fleet is outnumbered roughly 12 to 1, and that ratio will only get worse as the matriarchs produce more spawn." General Korath was the commander of the ground forces, and he slammed his fist against the table in frustration. "Then what do you suggest, Admiral?" he demanded. "Do we simply wait here and die while those monsters devour our world?" Vane met his angry gaze without flinching and shook her head slowly. "No, General, we do not wait, and we do not surrender, and we fight with everything we have. But we fight smart." She pulled up a holographic display of the system and highlighted several key positions. "The Zerathine are predators, and they think like predators, which means they will chase wounded prey, and they will take the easiest kills. First," she explained, "we use that instinct against them, and we draw them into ambushes and asteroid fields and debris clouds, where their numbers mean less. We make them bleed for every kilometer they advance," she continued, "and we buy time for the people on the surface to find another way." Captain Sarah Voss was the youngest officer at the table, and she spoke up with hesitation in her voice. "Admiral, what other way is there?" she asked. "The evacuation ships cannot outrun the swarm, and we have nowhere to retreat." Vane was silent for a long moment, and then she looked toward the viewport where the distant shape of Vela Prime hung against the stars. "I do not know, Captain," she admitted, "but the High Seismark has called an emergency session of the Imperial Council, and she says there may be hope beneath the surface." She turned back to her officers, and her eyes were hard with determination. "Our job is to give them the time they need to find that hope, and we will hold the line until our ships are broken and our guns are silent, and then we will hold it some more." The fleet moved out to meet the swarm, and the first major engagement began near the frozen moon of Calath, where Valerie destroyers had laid minefields in the approaches. The mines claimed dozens of hunter beasts, and the explosions lit up the darkness like a string of small suns. But the swarm simply flowed around the danger zones and absorbed the losses without slowing, and they fell upon the destroyer squadron with terrible fury. Commander Lyris Thane fought her ship the Defiant Star until the hull was breached in 17 places and atmosphere vented from every deck. She ordered her crew to the escape pods and stayed at the helm alone and drove her crippled vessel directly into the mouth of a warrior beast. The explosion killed the creature and damaged 3 others nearby, and Commander Thane became the first of many heroes who would sacrifice themselves in the battles to come. News of the fighting reached Valor Prime within hours, and the people watched the casualty reports scroll across their screens with growing horror. The names of the dead filled page after page, and they were not just soldiers, but sons and daughters and parents and friends in the deep observatory High Seismark Corvain. Dash felt every death like a wound in her own heart, and she worked frantically with her team to understand the Leviathan's condition. The ancient creature was stirring more actively now, and its heartbeat had increased to once every few hours, and massive tremors shook the underground chambers. "It wants to fight," Mara said as she studied the biological readings. "It can sense the threat above, and it is trying to wake itself." Corvain nodded, and her face was drawn with exhaustion and worry. "Yes, it wants to fight, but it cannot, and not yet, and maybe not ever," she replied. "The wounds from the last battle are still healing, and if it rises now, it will burn through all its reserves in minutes." She pulled up historical records from 1,000 years ago and showed them to her assistant. "Look at what happened last time," she said. "The Leviathan drove away the Zerathine, but it nearly died in the process, and it has been sleeping ever since to recover. How long does it need?" Myra asked. Corvain closed her eyes and did the calculations in her head based on the healing rate she had observed. At least another 500 years. She said quietly, maybe more. The weight of those words hung in the air between them, and both women understood what it meant. The Leviathan could not save them, and the fleet could not save them, and there seemed to be no hope at all. But Corvain Thess had not become high seismark by accepting defeat, and she began to search the ancient records for any possibility that might give her people a chance, and in those dusty archives, she found something that changed everything. The Imperial Council met in the Great Hall beneath the capital city, and the chamber had been carved from the living rock of the Leviathan's shoulder blade. Countless generations ago, 12 council members sat around the curved table, and they represented every major faction and territory in the Valori Empire, and their faces showed the strain of sleepless nights and terrible news. High Seismark Corvain Thess stood at the center of the room, and behind her floated holographic displays showing biological data and ancient records and diagrams that most of the council members could not fully understand. Thank you all for coming so quickly, she began, and her voice echoed in the sacred space. I know you have seen the reports from the front, and I know you understand how dire our situation has become. Chancellor Mordith Val was the eldest member of the council, and he had served the Empire for 60 years through peace and crisis alike. The fleet has lost nearly a quarter of its strength in just 2 days, he said gravely. Admiral Vane is performing miracles, but she cannot hold forever, and the swarm grows larger with every hour. Evacuation is impossible, added General Korath, who attended via holographic projection from his command post. The Zarathene are faster than our civilian vessels, and they have already cut off the outer shipping lanes. A murmur of despair ran through the council, and several members bowed their heads in grief. Then we are doomed, whispered Councillor Thesa Kane, and she represented the mining colonies that had been the first to fall silent as the swarm advanced. Corvain raised her hand for silence, and the council members looked to her with desperate hope in their eyes. There may be another way, she said, but I must warn you that what I am about to propose will sound like madness. She activated the holographic display, and it showed a 3-dimensional model of the Leviathan in all its terrible glory. Our ancestors discovered something about our relationship with the Ancient One, she explained, something they kept secret for generations because they feared what people might do with the knowledge. She zoomed in on cellular structures and genetic markers that pulsed with soft light. We are connected to the Leviathan at the deepest level of our biology, she continued. When our ancestors first encountered the creature, they consumed its shed cells and tissue as food during a great famine. Over thousands of years, those cells became part of us and rewrote portions of our genetic code, and now every Valori carries traces of the Leviathan within their bodies. Elder theorist Mahandrail was the Empire's foremost expert on ancient history, and he nodded slowly as understanding dawned on his weathered face. The bonding rituals, he said quietly. The old ceremonies where our people would enter the deep caverns and commune with the sleeping god. Yes, Corvain confirmed. Those rituals were not merely symbolic, and they created a genuine biological connection between our people and the creature. She paused and took a deep breath before speaking the words that would change everything. That connection can be used to transfer energy, she said. Life force, if you prefer that term, and a Valori who enters the Leviathan willingly can be absorbed, and their biological energy will accelerate the creature's healing. The council chamber fell silent, and the weight of her words pressed down on everyone present. You are suggesting that we feed ourselves to the beast, Chancellor Val said, and his voice was barely a whisper. I'm suggesting that we give our people a choice, Corvain replied. Those who volunteer would not simply die, and they would become part of something greater, and their energy would fuel the Leviathan's recovery. How many would be needed? Asked Councillor Yaren Marsh, and he was a practical man who always focused on numbers and logistics. Corvain hesitated, and this was the part she had dreaded most. The Leviathan needs 500 years of healing compressed into days, she said. To achieve that, we would need billions of volunteers. The number hung in the air like a death sentence, and several council members gasped in horror. You are asking us to sacrifice our entire civilization, General Korath shouted through his holographic image. This is insanity. I am asking us to give our people the choice to save their children. Corvain shot back with fire in her eyes. The alternative is extinction, and every man and woman and child devoured by the swarm with nothing left to show. We ever existed. She brought up footage from the fleet battles, and the council watched in silence, as Valory ships were torn apart by waves of hunter beasts. If the Leviathan rises now without additional power, it will die within minutes, she explained, and its death throes will crack the planet's crust and kill everyone on the surface. Anyway, but if we give it strength, then it can fight, and it can win, and some of our people will survive to carry on our legacy. Mahindrail rose from his seat, and his ancient bones creaked with the effort, but his voice was strong and clear. I have studied our history for my entire life, he said, and I have always wondered why our ancestors chose to build their civilization around a sleeping monster. Instead of fleeing to safer worlds, he looked around at his fellow council members with tears in his eyes. Now I understand, he continued. They knew this day would come eventually, and they knew we would need the Leviathan's protection, and they knew what price we might have to pay. They trusted us to make the right choice when the time came. The debate continued for hours, and voices were raised in anger and grief and desperate hope. Some argued that they should fight to the last without asking anyone to sacrifice themselves, and others suggested surrendering to the swarm in hopes of mercy that everyone knew would never come. But in the end, the vote was unanimous, and the council agreed to present the choice to the people of the Empire. The announcement went out across every communication channel and every screen and every speaker in every city and village and outpost. Chancellor Val delivered the message himself, and his weathered face showed the weight of every word he spoke. People of the Valori Empire, he began, we face an enemy that cannot be defeated by our fleets alone, and we face extinction unless we find another way. Beneath our feet sleeps a guardian that has protected our world for ages beyond counting, and that guardian can save. Use us, but it needs our help. He explained the sacrifice that was being asked, and he made clear that no one would be forced, and no one would be judged for refusing. This is a choice that each of you must make for yourself, he said. Those who volunteer will walk into the deep caverns and give themselves to the Leviathan, and their energy will power its awakening. Those who wish to fight with the fleet may do so, and those who wish to stay with their families until the end may do that as well. We ask only that you choose with clear eyes and full hearts, and know that whatever you decide, your empire honors you. The message ended, and across the planet people looked at each other with fear and wonder and something that might have been hope, and then the volunteers began to gather. The first volunteers arrived at the deep caverns within hours of the announcement, and they were the elderly and the sick and the dying, who said they had nothing left to lose and everything to give. Mark Thorne was 93 years old, and he had lived through 2 wars and raised 4 children and buried his wife 10 years ago. He walked into the registration center with his back straight and his eyes clear, and when the young clerk asked why he had come, he simply smiled. I have lived a good life, he said, and my grandchildren deserve to live good lives too, and if my old bones can help make that happen, then I will consider it a blessing. Behind him stretched a line of people that wound through the streets of the capital and disappeared around distant corners, and every face showed the same quiet determination. The administrators had expected hundreds of volunteers, and perhaps a few thousand at most, but the numbers kept growing as word spread across the planet. By the end of the first day, more than 10 million people had registered, and the line showed no sign of shrinking. High Seismark Corvain. Thess watched the processions from her office in the deep observatory, and she wept openly at what she was seeing. These were her people, and they were choosing to die so that others might live, and the courage of it broke her heart, even as it filled her with fierce pride. She had volunteered herself, of course, but the council had refused her request, and they said she was needed to monitor the Leviathan and guide the process. So she stayed and watched and bore witness to the greatest act of collective sacrifice in the history of her civilization. The caverns beneath the capital had been prepared centuries ago for this very purpose, though no one had ever believed that they would actually come. Vast tunnels led down into the depths where the Leviathan's body formed walls and floor and ceiling, and the air grew warm and thick with the creature's ancient breath. The volunteers walked in groups of 1,000, and they carried no possessions and wore simple white robes that had been provided by the temple. Priest music played from speakers along the tunnel walls, and it was the old songs that every Valori child learned in school, and the melodies echoed through the stone like memories of better days. Veth Corrales was 34 years old, and she had worked as an engineer on the orbital shipyards until the evacuation order came. Her daughter, Lyra, was only 7, and she had been placed on one of the few ships that managed to escape before the swarm closed the outer lanes. Veth could have gone with her, but there was not enough room for all the parents, and someone had to stay behind. She held a small stuffed animal in her hands as she walked, and it was shaped like the Leviathan with button eyes and soft fabric fins, and Lyra had loved it since she was a baby. "I want you to have this," Lyra had said before boarding the evacuation ship. "So you won't be lonely, Mama." Veth had promised to keep it safe, and now she carried it toward the end of her life as a reminder of why she was making this choice. A recording drone floated beside her, capturing images for the historical archive. And when it asked if she wanted to leave a message, she nodded. "Tell my daughter that I went singing," she said, and her voice was steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Tell her that the beast woke up with her mother's courage in its heart, and tell her that I will always be watching over her from somewhere inside the stars." She kissed the stuffed toy and handed it to the drone operator. "Give this to her when she is old enough to understand," she said, "and tell her that I love her more than all the worlds in all the galaxies." The tunnel opened into a vast chamber where the Leviathan's mouth gaped wide, enough to swallow entire buildings, and the volunteers formed orderly lines as beges. They approached the threshold. There was no pain, according to the scientists, and the creature's biology was designed to absorb organic material quickly and efficiently, and death would come in seconds. But knowing that did not make the final steps any easier. Veterans of the old wars marched in formation, and they sang their fleet anthems one last time, and their voices echoed through the chamber with defiant pride. Families walked together, hand in hand, and parents who had already sent their children away held each other close and whispered words of love. Young people who had barely begun their lives stepped forward with fear in their eyes, but determination in their hearts. And through it all the music played and the songs mixed with the sound of footsteps and quiet crying and occasional laughter from those who found peace in their final moments. General Korath watched the processions through security cameras from his command post, and he had never felt more proud or more humble in his entire military career. These were not soldiers trained for sacrifice, and these were ordinary people who had chosen to become heroes. He recorded his own message and sent it to the archives. "Let no one ever say that the Valori were cowards," he said. "Let no one ever forget what our people gave so that their children might survive. They walked into the dark with songs on their lips and love in their hearts, and they did not waver and they did not falter. This is who we are." The Leviathan's biological readings spiked with every wave of volunteers, and systems that had been dormant for centuries began to activate as power flooded through its ancient body. Its heartbeat grew stronger and faster, and tremors shook the ground. With increasing intensity, 72 hours after the first, volunteers stepped into the caverns. The creature's power reserves reached critical levels, and its wounds began to heal at visible speed. Tissue that had taken decades to regenerate now grew back in minutes, and armor plates that had been cracked reformed stronger than before. The sacrifice was working. 4 billion people walked into the deep caverns during those 3 days, and 4 billion lives became fuel for the Guardians. Awakening. The population of Vela Prime dropped from 12 billion to 8 billion, and then to 4 billion, and still the volunteers kept coming. Those who remained were the young children and their caretakers and the essential personnel needed to run the monitoring systems and the skeleton crews that would witness what came next, and the soldiers and spacers of the fleet who would fight alongside their awakened god. Admiral Vane received word that the Leviathan was nearly ready, and she gathered what remained of her battered fleet for one final stand. All ships form up on the eternal vigil. She ordered, "We have held the line long enough, and now we prepare to advance." The Zerathine swarm had pushed deep into the system, and the first matriarch was within striking distance of Vela Prime itself, but the predators did not know what waited for them beneath the surface. They did not know that 4 billion souls had given everything to wake a sleeping god. They did not know that the hunt was about to become their funeral. The ground split open across 3 continents, and the sound was like nothing the survivors had ever heard before. It was thunder and earthquake and the roar of an ancient beast waking from dreams that had lasted longer than civilizations. The Leviathan rose from the broken crust of Vela Prime, and its body was wreathed in molten rock and superheated gas that streamed from its armor like a cloak of fire. 300 kilometers of primordial predator climbed toward the stars, and its eyes blazed with golden light that could be seen from orbit. Admiral Vane watched from the bridge of the eternal vigil, and she felt tears streaming down her face as the creature that had slumbered beneath her world finally revealed its true form. "All ships, fall back to safe distance," she ordered, and her voice cracked with emotion. "This is no longer our fight." The Leviathan's first roar was a subsonic frequency that traveled through the vacuum of space as vibration and radiation, and something that felt almost like rage made manifest. The Zerathine swarm hesitated, and for the first time in their recorded history, the predators showed something that might have been fear. They had hunted countless worlds and devoured billions of prey organisms, and nothing had ever made them pause before. But this creature was different, and they could sense the power radiating from its ancient body, and they could feel the 4 billion souls burning within its heart. The first matriarch turned to face the rising god, and it opened its massive maw to release a swarm of hunter beasts that numbered in the thousands. The small creatures raced toward the Leviathan like a cloud of locusts, and their claws gleamed in the light of the distant sun. The Leviathan did not even try to dodge, and it simply swept one massive claw through the swarm, and the force of the blow scattered the hunter beast like leaves in a hurricane. Hundreds died instantly, and crushed by the impact or torn apart by the shockwave, and the survivors fled back toward their mothership in disarray. The matriarch screamed in frequencies that made the surviving Valori ships vibrate, and it launched itself at the Leviathan with all its terrible bulk. The 2 giants collided in a clash that released energy readings off every scale the fleet's sensors possessed. They grappled in the void, and claws tore at armor, and teeth sought vulnerable flesh, and ichor sprayed in frozen clouds that glittered like dark stars. The Leviathan was smaller than the matriarch, but it was older and fiercer and powered by the willing sacrifice of billions. It drove its head forward, and its jaws closed around one of the matriarch's primary limbs, and it bit down with force that could crush starship hulls. Limbs severed, and the matriarch howled and tried to pull away, but the Leviathan followed with relentless fury. Its claws found the soft tissue beneath the creature's armor plates, and it began to tear and rip and dig toward the vital organs within. The other two matriarchs joined the battle, and they struck at the Leviathan from different angles, and their combined assault would have overwhelmed any normal opponent. Great wounds opened across the Leviathan's flanks, and ichor that burned like acid in the vacuum poured from gashes that exposed muscle and bone. But the Guardian would not fall. Every wound seemed to make it fight harder, and every injury just added to its rage. Deep within its body, the energy of 4 billion Valori burned like a sun, and that power flowed to damaged tissue and repaired it almost as fast as new wounds appeared. The battle raged for hours, and the surviving Valori fleet watched in awe as their god fought against impossible odds. Admiral Vane ordered her ships to engage the smaller Zerathine creatures that tried to swarm the Leviathan, and for the first time in the war, the fleet fought with hope instead of despair. Captain Siravos led a squadron of destroyers against a pack of warrior beasts that were trying to attack the Leviathan's eyes, and she lost half her ships but drove the creatures back. Commander Jeth Marlowe rammed his crippled cruiser into the mouth of a hunter beast that was about to strike at the Guardian's exposed spine, and his sacrifice bought precious seconds for the Leviathan to finish off the first matriarch. The great beast body went limp and began to drift, and smaller creatures fled from its dying form in all directions. 2 more to go. The second matriarch tried to flee, but the Leviathan was faster despite its wounds, and it caught the creature near the outer asteroid belt, and the battle there was shorter and more brutal. The Leviathan had learned from the first fight, and it went straight for the vital organs, and it tore the matriarch apart from the inside out. The third and final matriarch released every remaining creature in its brood in a desperate last stand, and thousands of hunter beasts and warrior beasts swarmed the wounded god. For a moment, it seemed like the Leviathan might finally fall, and its body was covered in writhing parasites that tore at every wound and weak point. But then it roared again, and the sound carried something new and something that felt like triumph. Mixed with grief, it remembered the 4 billion souls who had given themselves to this moment, and it drew upon that power one final time. Energy blazed from its eyes and mouth and every wound on its body, and the light was so bright that the fleet's sensors overloaded and went dark. When they came back online, the swarm was broken, and millions of Zerathine corpses drifted in the void, and the surviving creatures were fleeing into the darkness between stars. The Leviathan floated among the remains of its enemies, and its wounds were grievous, and its body was barely holding together. But it lived. It turned slowly toward the distant shape of Vela Prime, and it began the long journey home. The creature that had risen as a weapon of war returned as something different, and its fury had burned away in the battle, and now it moved with exhaustion and something that might have been sorrow. It had felt every soul that flowed into its body, and it remembered their faces and their names and their final thoughts. 4 billion people had trusted it with their lives, and it had honored that trust with victory. The Leviathan settled back into the broken crust of Valor Prime, and the molten rock cooled around its body and formed new mountains and valleys. Its heartbeat slowed to once every few minutes, and then once every hour, and finally back to the ancient rhythm of once every 73 years. The remaining Valori watched as their world was transformed by the Guardian's return, and new caverns opened, and new lands rose from the sea. They built monuments to the fallen in every city and town, and the names of 4 billion heroes were carved into walls that stretched for miles. High Seismark Corvain Thess composed the message that would be broadcast across the galaxy, and it was transmitted on every frequency that Valori technology could reach. We are the Valori. The message said, "We are small and brief and mortal, and we do not live forever as some species do. But we do not abandon our own, and we do not abandon our world, and we do not abandon the ancient ones who share our home. Come to us in peace, and find welcome and friendship and trade. Come to us as conquerors and learn what sacrifice means to those who love something greater than themselves." The Leviathan sleeps beneath our feet, and it dreams of the 4 billion souls who gave it strength. We remain and we rebuild and we remember. And if you threaten our children or our world or our future, we will wake our God again. You have been warned. The message spread across the Crescent Nebula and beyond, and species who had never heard of the Valori learned their name and their story. Some came as friends and others kept their distance, and the Zerathine never returned. In the years that followed, the Valori rebuilt their civilization stronger than before, and they told the story of the sacrifice to every generation. Children learned the names of the heroes who walked into the dark, and they grew up knowing that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they loved something enough to die for it. And deep beneath the surface, the Leviathan slept and healed and waited. Its dreams were filled with the voices of 4 billion souls who had become part of it forever. They sang the old songs together in those dreams, and they watched over their descendants. With pride and love, the Empire endured, and the Guardian protected it, and the memory of sacrifice kept both strong. This was the legacy of the Valori, and this was the price of survival, and this was the gift that 4 billion people gave to all the generations that would come after them. They had faced extinction, and they had chosen to fight, and they had won, not through strength of arms or superior technology, but through love and courage and the willingness to give everything for those who would come after. That was the true power of the Valori. That was why the galaxy learned to respect them, and that was why the Leviathan dreamed of them with something that might have been gratitude forever.